Sensory receptors tutorial.
In this lesson, you will gather and use information to explain that sensory receptors respond to stimuli by sending messages to the brain. Warm-up. Open the notebook tool and answer these questions. Imagine that you go for a walk outside. How would you experience this walk using all 5 senses of the human body? Do you think plants sense their environment?
Hi, I'm Hannah Vo, and I'm a journalist. I really love science, and I also love writing. My job is interesting these days because it allows me to play video games. That's the best part about writing for gaming magazines. I get to play video games on the job. Video games are always fun to play. Do you know how many senses I use every time I play a game? While reviewing games, I depend on my senses of sight and hearing to get me through each level. The game controller responds to my touch and pressure. If I'm using a full body motion controller, it responds to movements from different parts of my body. Some specialized movie theaters have machines that allow moviegoers to smell the environment depicted in the movie. I'm sure it's just a matter of time before video games follow suit. The entertainment industry continues to look for ways to engage our senses and immerse us into the world they create. But have you ever wondered why humans have so many senses in the first place? It's all because of the nervous system. In this lesson, you'll see how the nervous system works to create the 5 main senses. You'll also learn how other organisms sense the environment.
Nerves and touch. A cup of hot chocolate feels warm to the touch. A lemon tastes sour. Loud music hurts the ears. These sensations occur because of the sensory organs, which function with the help of sensory receptors. Sense organs are an important part of the nervous system, the centralized system that regulates the body. When someone pulls a hand away from a hot object, it's because the nervous system and sensory organs are at work. The skin is the largest organ in the human body. It's composed of thousands of nerve endings that allow us to sense our environment. Most of us rarely think about our sensory abilities, especially the sense of touch. However, this function is quite complex. Let's explore how we sense touch with the help of an engineered skin model called eSkin.
New eSkin feels heat, textures, and more. This new simulated skin could make prosthetic limbs and other medical devices work more like the real thing. Control plus 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 plus. A new electronic skin can feel the raspy texture of sandpaper, the beat of someone's pulse, and even heat. But there's more. It also can detect sound. This rubbery plastic and carbon filament mimics the structure of human skin, reports this person and his team in October 30th Science Advances. That sounds like a scientific journal. And remember, when you do a study or an experiment and you publish your results in a scientific journal, it's the first time anyone has demonstrated an e-skin that can sense so many different types of stimuli, says Alex Chortos. That's the innovative and impressive part of this work, points out this materials scientist. He works at Stanford University in Palo Alto, California. Chortos is part of a team that developed other pressure sensing e-scan. It can relay signals directly to brain cells based on tests with cells that had been isolated from a mouse. Those cells got the skin's message too. They become more or less active depending on how hard the researchers pushed on the skin. These researchers described their advance in October 16 in Science. Such work offers a blueprint for scientists to actually, quote, bridge electronics with biology, unquote, says Wenlong Chang. He's a chemical engineer at Australia's Monash University in Clayton, Victoria. Both Chorto's skin to cell communication system and Co's super sensing e-scan bring more lifelike artificial skins closer to practical use. In the future, we could combine these techniques for real. Operational electronic skin, says Ko, a materials scientist. He works at the Ulsan National Institute of Science and Technology in South Korea. One day, such an e-scan might cover prosthetic limbs and plug directly into people's nerve cells. He says, this would let people know if they were touching something hot or rough or sharp, just as real skin does. The artificial skin also could form the basis for soft, wearable medical devices. Over the last several years, scientists have invented an assortment of electronic skin components. These range from different soft materials to new types of sensors. Some sensors can recognize more than one type of stimuli, but only under just the right conditions. E-skins are still far from having the capabilities that human skin has, he admits, but the newly reported advances do bring the prospect of such technology closer. By mimicking the ultra sensitive skin of human fingertips, Coe and his colleagues designed their e skin to detect types of signals. The researchers placed a soft, ridged film over the thin, bumpy sheets made from plastic and graphene. Graphene is a single atom thick sheet of carbon with a host of unusual properties. Those thin, bumpy sheets are only about as thick of a few layers of the plastic cling wrap used to seal up kitchen leftovers. Touching this e-scan pressed together, the electrodes on the bumpy sheets. Touching this e-scan pressed together the electrodes on the bumpy sheets. This caused an electric current to flow through the device, which was hooked up to a machine to measure such signals. The amount of current depended on how much the bumps compressed. This provided a gauge of the pressure. Heating the Korean team's e-scan also generated a current, showing that it could sense temperature too. A strip of e-skin placed on a person's wrist let the researchers simultaneously measure skin temperature and blood pressure, and ridges on the simulated skin help it detect texture. When researchers skimmed its surface over glass or sandpaper, the ridges vibrated. The pattern of those vibrations differed depending on what had touched it. Sensors in the skin picked up on those differences. Sound waves also made the e-skin vibrate. It could hear noise from a speaker playing a famous lecture by the late physicist Richard Feynman. The e-skin converted his words into electrical signals and then sent them to a machine. This let the researchers judge how well the e-skin sensed sounds. It worked even better than an iPhone's microphone, Coe concluded. Wow. Cheng thinks such an e-scan might hold promise to use for use in soft wearable hearing aids. Unlike conventional aids, he says, soft devices are more comfortable because they mold to human skin. Power words. For more about power words, click here. Atom, the basic unit of chemical element. Chemical engineer, a researcher who uses chemistry. Electric current, a flow of charge called electricity. Electrode, in chemistry, materials that serve as an anode or cathode. Electronics, devices that are powered by electricity but whose properties are controlled by the semiconductors or other circuitry that channel or gate the movement of electric charges. Graphene, a super strong sheet of carbon that's only one atom thick. Because it is also thin, transparent, and can conduct electricity, the electronics industry is finding many potential uses for the material. Innovation, an adaptation or improvement to existing idea. Materials science, the study of how the atomic and molecular structure of a material is related to its overall properties. Physicists, a science who studies the nature and properties of matter and energy. Prosthesis, an artificial device that replaces a missing body part. RASP, a metal carpentry and metalworking tool that works like a coarse file to grind or scrape the rough edges off of something, or something that has an abrasive surface, like a rough sounding voice, is described as a raspy voice. Sensor, a device that picks up information or physical or chemical conditions. Simulate, to deceive in some way by imitating the form or function of something. Stimulus, something that prompts a response in a living organism or in a controlled environment, including a chemical or physical test system. And then notice that they cited their sources, and even the original source, and here's the original journal source. This format for how they cite this is really important to some people, and making sure you don't plagiarize is important to everybody, or it should be. So the first question says, what's the author's purpose in using the phrase bridge electronics with biology? The author indicates that the creation of eScan needs both computer scientists and life scientists to work together. Therefore, eScan acts as a bridge between these two different disciplines. Based on the information in the article, do you think that a human body has one type of sensory receptor or several types of sensory receptors? The article talks about several types of receptors that can detect and respond to different stimuli. It also mentions that receptors on eScan can detect heat, texture, and sound. Another type of eScan can also detect pressure changes. What are the advantages of nerve to cell eScan for people with prosthetic limbs? It connects directly to the nerve cells in the body. These nerve cells transmit signals to the brain. This arrangement may only allow people with artificial limbs to sense the environment as if they still had their natural limbs. Why did the author think eScan could make better hearing aids? In your answer, explain how the ears connect to the nervous system. Oh boy. Sound is one of the five major senses. The nervous system carries sound signals from the sensory receptors to the brain. eSkin has many sensory receptors that can carry signals toward the brain, enabling us to react to sounds. Because eSkin is soft, scientists can use it to make effective hearing aids that are quite comfortable to wear.
The nerve cell. Sensory receptors are a part of the nervous system. So the nervous system is responsible for the five senses. sound, sight, touch, taste, and smell. The nervous system has two main parts, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The brain and the spinal cord are the command centers. They form the central nervous system. Nerves branch out from the central nervous system and run throughout the body. This network of nerves forms the peripheral nervous system. Nerves are made of nerve tissue. This tissue contains special cells called neurons that transmit messages to the central nervous system. The brain processes these messages, which are electrical signals, and sends responses back to the nerves through these neurons. Neurons are specialized cells of the nervous system that help in the transmission of messages. Let's look at the parts of a neuron. Cell body. The cell body of a neuron, also called the soma or cyton, is the main support center. It contains the neuron's nucleus. Dendrites. The dendrites are extensions branching out from the cell body. Dendrites react with chemicals secreted by other neurons and help in the movement of electrical impulses. Axon. The axon is a long, slender projection that extends from the cell body. It carries messages from the neuron to other neurons, muscles, or glands. Myelin sheath. The myelin sheath is an insulating layer of fat that protects an axon. This sheath helps increase electrical conduction. There are 3 types of neurons, and each type performs a specific function. Sensory neurons. Sensory neurons carry signals from the environment to the nervous system. For example, sensory receptors in the ears carry sound waves to the brain through sensory neurons. Motor neurons. Motor neurons facilitate the contraction and relaxation of muscles. These neurons carry signals away from the nervous system. For example, motor neurons carry signals from the brain to muscle tissue. Autonomic neurons. These neurons carry out all involuntary activities.
So, motor neurons these neurons carry signals away from the nervous system. Motor neurons carry signals from the brain to muscle tissue. I think that's on a test.
Responding to stimuli. Reaction to stimuli is the function of the nervous system. The different nerves in the body come together and react to a particular change in the environment by responding to the change. A sensory receptor, or nerve ending, responds to stimuli. For example, the sensory receptors in the skin help us sense a change in temperature. They also help us feel pain. The receptors in our eyes help us see. The sensory receptors are primarily responsible for responses to stimuli, but other parts of the nervous system are involved in the process too. These are the 3 steps in the process of sensing and responding to a particular stimulus. 1. Sensory input. 2. Integration. 3. Motor response. Sensory input. We receive stimuli from the environment. A sensory receptor receives these stimuli. If our eyes see a snake, they send a signal to the brain through the sensory receptors. Integration. The brain processes the signal and creates a response. In this case, the brain processes the image of the snake and forms a response. Motor response. The brain stimulates the motor neurons to send a response signal. These motor neurons stimulate a particular organ to act. The brain stimulates the motor neurons, which, in our example, stimulate the muscles in our legs to move away from the snake. Stimulus can be either external or internal. An external stimulus is any stimulus the body receives from the environment. Internal stimulus is any stimulus the body receives from its internal organs. When people smell their favorite food, their mouth starts to water. In other words, they start to salivate. This response happens because the sensory receptors in the nose send a message to the brain, which processes this message. Send a message to the brain, which processes this message. The brain then stimulates the motor neurons to elicit the response, which is the production of saliva. An example of an internal stimulus is the passage of food from the food pipe into the stomach during digestion. The nervous system, which regulates the digestive tract, detects the food coming into the stomach and releases enzymes to help in digestion. Sensory receptors don't always send messages to the brain. Sometimes the body responds instantly to a stimulus. This instantaneous, involuntary response to a stimulus is a reflex. For example, when people touch a hot stove, they immediately pull back their hands. This action happens even before the brain can process the sensory signals and direct the appropriate responses. In such cases, the spinal cord gives the initial response. A sensory neuron first receives the stimulus. It then sends the message to the spinal cord. The message moves through the spinal cord, which processes the message. The spinal cord then transfers the response to the motor neuron, which activates the response organ. Because the signal moves in the form of an arc, the name for this process is the reflex arc. After the initial response, every other reaction, such as feeling pain or applying medication to protect a wound, all involve the brain. Type your response in the box. Mary is sitting on a bench and reading a book. Suddenly, someone grabs her arm. Mary is startled. She finds that her muscles have tensed up. When Mary looks up, she sees her friend Denise, who surprised her. Mary feels relieved. She leaps up and hugs Denise. Explain how Mary's nervous system helped her carry out the described activities. Also explain whether her reactions were reflexive or voluntary.
Mary received an external stimulus when Denise grabbed her arm. Her sensory receptors transported a signal to the spinal cord, so Mary's jump was reflexive. But when she saw Denise, the sensory receptors in Mary's eyes sent a message to her brain. Her brain processed and created responses and sent them to her muscles and hands. As a result, Mary jumped up and hugged Denise, which is a voluntary action. So, reflexive. In the guided notes, it says Mary's jump was reflexive, but I couldn't find where else it said that. Types of sensory receptors.
Types of sensory receptors. Skin contains countless sensory receptors. These receptors help us touch. They help us feel pain, pressure, and temperature changes. Like our skin, our eyes, nose, tongue, and ears also have sensory receptors. These receptors help us to see, smell, taste, and hear. Let's look at each type of receptor in detail. The human eye. We see blue skies, green forests, colorful flowers, and all the world around us because of different receptors located inside our eyes. The retina and the optic nerve are the components of the eye that are involved in vision. The eye sends signals to the brain, which processes the signals and creates a response. The eye sends signals to the brain, which processes the signals and stores in it. The optic nerve is a large nerve that connects the eye to the brain and allows signals to pass through it. Two types of sensory receptors, called photoreceptors, are found in the retina. Cones help us see different colors, and rods help us see in low light. Rods can't identify color very well, which is why people can't see color very well in the dark.
Iris, pupil, cornea, lens, retina, optic nerve. Where's the cone and the rods?
Before we learn about how the eye perceives color, let's explore how light affects the images we see. Light is a form of electromagnetic radiation. Light travels in the form of waves and is a source of energy related to the electronic and magnetic fields. Light, or visible light, is the only form of electromagnetic radiation that we can see. White light is composed of different colors that have different wavelengths. If light is passed through a prism, different colors are seen on the other side of the prism. This effect occurs because the prism splits light into different colors as the light passes through it. The cone receptors in our eyes help us identify color. There are 3 types of cone cells: red, blue, and green. These receptors function best in bright light. When white light falls on an object, the object absorbs some of the light and reflects the rest of it. The wavelengths it reflects are the colors our eyes see. For example, think about a banana. It looks yellow in bright sunlight because it reflects yellow light and absorbs the rest of the light. In a pitch-dark room, however, the yellow color might not be visible. Instead, the banana will look gray or black. Then we can likely identify the banana by its shape. Hearing, taste, and smell. Our ears, tongue, and nose also have sensory receptors. Let's learn some more about them. Ears have auditory receptors that help us hear. Sound travels in the form of waves. The auditory receptors connect to the auditory nerve in the brain. The auditory receptors capture the sound waves and transmit them to the brain. The brain processes these sound waves and stores in it. The olfactory receptors, located inside the nose, connect to the olfactory nerve. This nerve signals to the brain. The axons in these nerves carry the signals to the olfactory bulb, which in turn transfers them to the brain. The brain processes these signals and stores the smell in it. We can differentiate sweet, sour, salty, and bitter tastes. We can tell the difference between the tastes because of the sensory receptors found in our taste buds. Taste buds are located all over the tongue. The sides of the tongue are more sensitive to all tastes. The back of the tongue is highly sensitive to bitter tastes. Our mouths start watering when we smell freshly baked cookies. That's because the olfactory receptors in the nose send signals to the brain. The brain processes the signals and sends a response, which causes the mouth to start producing saliva. The saliva helps in food digestion. The taste receptors on the tongue allow us to taste the cookie, while the olfactory receptors help us smell the flavor. Together, these receptors give us the taste of the cookie. The link between the olfactory receptors and taste is evident when we have a bad cold. During a cold, our sense of smell decreases. Sometimes we can't smell food at all. Because we have a decreased sense of smell, food doesn't taste as good. Select the correct answer. Bats have a poor sense of sight, so they hunt their prey by emitting a high-frequency sound. They wait for an echo to bounce off a moving or stationary object. Based on the echo, they can determine if prey is nearby. Which types of sensory receptors help bats accomplish this task? senses in other organisms. Humans and most animals have a complex nervous system to respond to their environment. Some organisms, such as earthworms and jellyfish, have simple nervous systems. These nervous systems don't have separate brains and spinal cords. For example, sea stars have a ring of nerves. Earthworms have a nerve cord. Organisms such as microbes and plants don't have nervous systems at all. Let's look at how some organisms without a nervous system respond to stimuli. Bacteria. Bacteria are single-celled organisms, so they don't have a nervous system. However, they do respond to stimuli. Some bacteria have sensory receptors on their surface in the form of sensory proteins. These proteins detect the availability of food, and they sense changes in the surrounding environment. Some bacteria have whip-like tails called flagella that help them move and respond to stimuli. Euglenas. Euglena is a single-celled organism with the properties of both plant cells and animal cells. Euglenas can move, but they don't have cell walls. However, they contain chloroplasts. Euglenas have eye spots, which are light receptors that allow them to sense light and move toward the light source to make food.
Which totally goes against what the last one, the parts of the cell assignment had, where it said, look at this cell and what's wrong with it. What was wrong with it was that somebody had drawn an animal cell that featured chloroplasts. Well, that's because there's almost always an exception to the rule. In general, animal cells do not have chloroplasts. In this case, a eugelin, or whatever this was, has kind of features of both. So,
Plants. Plants don't have a nervous system, but they do respond to both internal and external stimulus. Plants wilt when they don't get enough water. The wilting is in response to an internal stimulus. Plants often grow toward a light source. Some flowers, such as sunflowers, always turn in the direction of light. The light is an external stimulus. The process of plants reacting to light is called phototropism.
Interesting. Phototropism.
Plants don't move much, but they do respond to external stimuli. This plant responds to light. When the light shines from the left, the plant grows to the left. When the light shines from the right, the plant grows to the right. These changes may be slow and hard to spot, but they do happen. Plants respond to external stimuli around them.
Type your response in the box. Stacy wants to know if plants have the same phototrophic reaction from artificial light as they do from natural light. Using steps in the scientific method, design an experiment that will test this effect.
So you would make observations. Plants appear to grow towards natural sunlight. Ask the question, would plants grow toward an artificial sunlight? Construct a hypothesis and make predictions. Plants will grow toward both sources of light. Test the hypothesis. Use two identical plants. Place one on a windowsill in sunlight. Place the other plant near a desk lamp. Observe the growth of the plants for 2 weeks. Analyze the results. After 2 weeks, determine whether both plants grew toward the light source. Test and modify the experiment. Repeat the experiment if the experiment proved the hypothesis. If not, modify the hypothesis and design a new experiment.
We've seen how single-celled organisms and plants react to stimuli. Now let's look at how some multicellular organisms without complex nervous systems respond to stimuli. Sponges. Sponges don't have nervous systems, but they do respond to stimuli. Sponges need water and nutrients to filter through their body. They have a mechanism that's similar to a sneeze mechanism. In a process that lasts about 45 minutes, sponges use this mechanism to take in nutrients and expel waste. Stimuli, such as sediments in water, trigger these reactions. It's still not clear how sponges sense environmental changes. Recent studies suggest that sponges may have a basic sensory organ that controls this mechanism. Sea stars. Sea stars have a simple nervous system. It consists of a ring of nerves branching into their arms. Sea stars also have eye spots that help them detect light. Open the notebook tool and review your answer to this question from the warm-up. Do you think plants sense their environment? Explain why or why not. Can you improve your answer?
Playing video games involves using our eyes, ears, and skin. The nervous system plays a major role in using our reflexes during games. I just tested a new full-body game controller. I loved the set of goggles that responded to my eye movements. I could actually see the game in 360 degrees. The controller also had headphones that immersed me in a full surround sound experience. The controllers that were attached to my arms and legs allowed me to feel things as I touched them during the game. This wonderful experience was all thanks to my nervous system. It has an amazing ability to coordinate touch, taste, sight, smell, and hearing to respond to both external and internal stimuli.
Congratulations, you have completed the tutorial Sensory Receptors. Now let's move on to the guided notes portion of this wonderful lesson. All right, so as we travel over to back to the assignment and click on the guided notes within the assignment, we find sensory receptors. The term sensory receptor is a nerve ending that senses and responds to stimulus. Nerve, a fiber or bundle of fibers that transmit signals to and from the body, brain, and spinal cord. Neuron, a nerve cell. Saliva, a watery liquid in the mouth that softens food for swallowing. Reflex, an involuntary response. Retina, the layer at the back of the eye that contains photoreceptors. Optic nerve, the nerve that connects the eye to the brain. Cone, a photoreceptor in the eye that processes color vision. Rod, a photoreceptor in the eye responsible for night vision. Electromagnetic, relating to electric and magnetic fields. Auditory receptor, a sensory receptor that detects sound. Olfactory receptor, a sensory receptor for smell. Taste bud, a group of cells in the mouth that contains sensory receptors for taste. Objective. In this lesson, you will gather and use information to explain that sensory receptors respond to stimuli by sending messages to the brain. Nerves and touch. The nerve cell. The nerve system is responsible for the five senses: sound, sight, touch, taste, and smell. The nervous system has two main parts: central nervous system, which is the brain and spinal cord; peripheral nervous system, nerves that branch out from the central nervous system and run throughout the body. Nerves are made of nerve tissue, which contains cells called neurons. Neurons are specialized cells of the nervous system that help in the transmission of messages. Dendrites are extensions that branch from the cell body, help in the movement of electrical impulses. The cell body, also called the soma or cyton, contains the neuron's nucleus. Axon or axon is a long projection. It carries messages to other neurons, muscles, or glands. Myelin sheath, insulating layer of fat, helps increase electrical conduction. So the terminal branches of axon form junctions with other cells. The neural impulse, electrical signal traveling down the axon. This is an axon. This is the cell body. Dendrites are these little extensions. There are 3 types of neurons, and each type performs a specific function. Sensory neurons carry signals from the environment to the nervous system. Motor neurons facilitate contraction and relaxation of muscles. They carry signals. Sorry, I had to go through and double check the tutorial. The motor neurons facilitate the contraction and relaxation of muscles. They carry signals away from the nervous system. Automatic neurons carry out all involuntary activities, match the nerve signals with the neurons that send them. So, allows legs to run during a track meet. That is the motor neuron. It sends a pain signal from a finger because of a pinprick. That is a sensory neuron. Signals the skin to sweat when it's hot is an autonomic neuron. Sends an image of a bird from the eyes is the sensory neuron. Signals digestion to start is also an autonomic neuron. Responding to stimuli. The 3 steps in the process of sensing and responding to a particular stimulus. Sensory input. A sensory receptor receives the stimuli. Integration. The brain processes the signal and creates a response. Motor response. The brain stimulates the motor neurons to send a response signal, which stimulates a particular organ to act. A stimulus can be external, received from the environment, or internal, received from the body's internal organs. What's really interesting is some diabetics can feel and sense when they are low. They can feel the inside of their body feeling a low blood glucose level. Anyways, reflex. Reflex. A message does not pass through the brain. A reflex message does not pass through the brain. A sensory neuron first receives the stimulus. It sends the message to the spinal cord. The message moves through the spinal cord, which processes the message. The spinal cord then transfers the response to the motor neuron, which activates the response organ. Ouch sends the message through a sensory nerve fiber up through the spinal cord into the brain, where the interneurons then fire and send through the motor's nerve fiber a response by effector. Interesting. Question. Mary is sitting on a bench. Suddenly, someone grabs her arm. Mary is startled and her muscles have tensed up. Mary received an internal stimulus when Denise grabbed her arm. Her sensory receptors transported a signal to the spinal cord. Mary being startled was a reflex or voluntary action. It was a reflex. But then, when Mary saw that it was just her friend Denise, she got up and hugged her. Hugging Denise is a voluntary action, and it should be voluntary, and you should always have permission. Types of sensory receptors: the human eye. The retina and the optic nerve are the components of the eye that are involved in vision. The eye sends signals to the brain, which processes the signals and creates a virtual image. Two types of sensory receptors called photoreceptors are found in the retina. Cones help us see different colors. Cones are sensory receptors called photoreceptors. Rods, also a photoreceptor, helps us see in low light. Hearing, taste, and smell. Ears have auditory receptors that help us hear. The auditory receptors connect to the auditory nerve in the brain. The auditory receptors capture the sound waves and transmit them to the brain. Olfactory receptors located inside the nose connect to the olfactory nerve. The axons in these nerves carry the signals to the olfactory nerve, which transfers them to the brain. The brain processes these signals as smells and scents. We can tell the difference between sweet, salty, sour, and bitter tastes because of the sensory receptors found in our taste buds. Taste buds are located all over the tongue. Senses in other organisms. Organisms without a nervous system can still respond to stimuli. Bacteria, some have sensory proteins that detect the availability of food and sense changes in the surrounding environment. Eugellina have eye spots, which are light receptors that allow them to sense light. Plants. Internal stimulus. Plants wilt when they don't get enough water. External stimulus. Plants often grow toward a light source, a process called phototropism. Sponges use a mechanism to take in nutrients and expel waste, triggered by stimuli such as sediments in the water. May be controlled by a basic sensory organ. Sea stars have eye spots that help them detect light. Now, write a summary about your perception of your surroundings, the tutorial, and these notes that you are reading. Describe how each of your senses and your nervous system work together to create these perceptions. All right. Hope you have a wonderful test, and remember, use your notes.